So first, just welcome everybody. Thank you for taking the time to come and be with us today and hopefully learn something new. My name's Christy Tadros. I'm a licensed clinical counselor. I own a therapy practice in the San Francisco Bay Area called West Coast Therapy and Wellness. I have worked with kids with selective mutism for many years now. Started training in New York with Dr. Stephen Kurtz, and then worked there for many years. And now I'm started in selective mutism program here in the Bay Area. And really happy to be here and be just partnering with SMA. They're such a wonderful organization and provide so much care and information to the community. So yeah, happy to be here. And then I'll let Desiree introduce herself.
Sure. I'm Desiree Camarda. I'm an educational therapist and executive functioning specialist in the California Bay Area as well. That I have a private practice, Innovations for Learning, and I'm also at a developmental pediatric clinic in Los Altos. And most of my education comes from Holy Names University in Oakland, where I was trained undergrad. That's where I got my teaching credentials, and also as an educational therapist. I've been in practice or doing educational therapy and teaching in the public schools for the past, this will date me, 30 years.
Thanks, Desiree. Yeah, Desiree and I worked together in the past, and she is amazing and a wealth of knowledge. So I feel really lucky to be doing this with her today. Yeah, and we have some housekeeping. So as people continue to come in, we'll just share a few things. In terms of the webinar today, we will be using the Q&A for questions. So I see there's already a question that's come in, for example, so we'll be doing our best to monitor that. There's a lot of folks here, so we might miss some questions. If we do, we'll be saving the Q&A, and Desiree and I will do our best to send out like a follow-up email to answer any questions that didn't go answered. Answering the first one right now, I don't think that there are CUs available today. That might be a question for Kristen that she could put into the chat. The chat will be a place for everybody to build community. If you want to say something, a comment, you want to say oh, me too, or anything +1, you can come into the chat to share and kind of connect with folks. But the Q&A will be what Desiree and I are really focusing on as we share. If you don't want your question in the Q&A to be identified with your name, there's an option to click anonymous. So just letting everybody know that that's an option. The session will be recorded, and SMA will send out a link in the next week with the recording. And then we also wanted to let you know about a few events coming up that SMA is running. So there is an SMTI for professionals, June 11th and 12th, that there's still space in, which is like a 2-day training in treating selective mutism. It's really great. Highly recommended if you're trying to learn more. And then the annual conference this year will be October 1st and 2nd, and registration is now open. And it will also be virtual this year. So thanks. I think we're going to get started. Yeah. Here we go. All right. And then Desiree, you can keep I'll have the Q&A open here as I'm talking, but you can kind of monitor it as I go. Okay. Great. So we're here to talk about, we're going to go back, school advocacy for kids with selective mutism, and really a focus today on navigating 504 and IEP plans, as that can be a confusing topic. So we're going to really get into that. We'd like to also just quickly start by thanking the Gordon and Marilyn Macklin Foundation for their generous grant and making these webinars and a lot of other learnings in SMA possible. So what are we going to be going over today? Just like I always like to know what I'm going to be learning in the next hour or so. So first, just kind of for those who it sounds like there's a lot of school professionals on here. So some of this might be knowledge you already have, but understanding what specialized services are available within your school district. So understanding what IEPs and 504's are. And then we're going to talk about how to access them. So how do you even request it? So what's the process after you request it, and so on. And then also, of course, we're going to talk about specific support within those services for children and teens with selective mutism. So kind of just in a nutshell to start off, just kind of giving basic definitions for those who are like, what's an IEP or a 504? All these acronyms, right? How are you supposed to know what they mean? So essentially, they're different kinds of plans. An IEP stands for an Individualized Education Plan. An IEP is a legal document, so it's an agreement between the school district and the family that is designed to outline direct services. So we're going to talk about how an IEP has services versus a 504 typically doesn't. Supports in progress towards measurable goals. So an IEP will have measurable goals for your child that the school district is now legally required to help them meet through these services and accommodations. Versus a 504 plan, which is kind of like, if you think about tiers, it's like almost like a tier down in terms of like the level of support, and it's not technically a legal document, but it's kind of it's an agreement. It's still a plan, and it's how the school will provide accommodations and modifications for your child to have optimal access to curriculum and instruction. So they're both plans. An IEP is in special education, which Desiree is going to talk about, which is a 504 plan, is still considered general education. So we're going to get more into that, but just so you know, they're both plans that are going to support your child at school to be more successful. When should you request an IEP or 504 plan? For the sake of today in this group, I bolded this first bullet point because that's typically the main reason, which is when your child's anxiety or other impairments are hindering their ability to engage in their education. So if your child's selective mutism, severe social anxiety, any other types of anxiety that they're experiencing are hindering them from being able to, as we know, like participate in class, answer a question from their teacher, ask a question about their learning, ask to use the bathroom, ask for help, be able to work with a partner at their desk on a worksheet or a game or something that they're doing in class. As we know, like if they get hurt and they can't let anybody know. So these are just a small list of the many ways that selective mutism can hinder a child from being able to engage in their education. And that's typically a sign when you want to request, you want to talk to the school and say, we might want to request an IEP or 504. Some other things to consider is that if the school's not willing or able to provide counseling or support services outside the classroom and your child needs that, which we're going to talk about how to determine whether they need that or not, that's typically in an IEP that they're going to get support services outside the classroom. Also, sometimes our children might be struggling with, or teens might be struggling with selective mutism, but also any other learning, cognitive, psychological, physical, or health impairments. So really, if your child is coming to school with anything that's hindering their ability to access and engage in their education, then they could qualify for a 504 or an IEP. Also, if you have like a teacher or school that's resistant to supporting the student or collaborating with the parents, sometimes when I'm working with families, we don't go down the road of having a plan, but we just have like a really helpful school that's like ready to work with us, ready to do anything to help this kid with anxiety and SM, and sometimes not so much. And then we do need to have something in writing. So yeah, that's something to to consider. And if you're thinking about, should I be requesting this? Should my child have an IEP or 504? If they do have selective mutism, the chances are yes, that they should at least have a 504 in school. And so just to kind of help, I wanted to outline, like, how do I know what to ask for? So like I said, a 504 plan is kind of like the base of the pyramid, and then an IEP is the highest level of support. So a 504 plan is essentially a document with a list of accommodations. So for example, I put like example of an accommodation here would be that your child has one-on-one time to fade in with the teacher. So that would be something that might be listed like at the beginning of the school year. The student is able to come in early and have one-on-one time, which in the selective mutism world we call like a fade in with the teacher. Or like another example of an accommodation listed on a 504 would be that your child receives positive reinforcement in the classroom for talking, and the teacher uses praise or points. There's many other accommodations that your child could have, but typically a 504 is listing accommodations in the classroom. So something that the teacher can do to support the child. The next kind of level for should I ask for more is typically when I'm working with families with selective mutism, teens and kids. We're also looking to advocate for counseling services. So within a school district, there can be like general ed counseling services, and then there can also be special ed counseling. Depending on your district, they may be offering general ed counseling services in a 504 plan. So we might not need to go to an IEP. You might say, you would ask, like, could my child also receive some either pull out, which means a counselor comes to the classroom and pulls them out and works with them, or push in, or the counselor goes into the classroom to work with them. So sometimes we can attach that to a 504 plan and get it written in to the plan. There are many districts, however, where any type of services outside the classroom will not be available unless the child has an IEP. So that's one of the differences between a 504 and IEP, is that they will have outside services. So some of the specialized services within an IEP are sometimes counseling, working with a school psychologist, occupational therapy, working with a speech and language pathologist, also getting any academic and resource support. And that also the difference between a 504 and IEP is that an IEP actually has goals. And we're going to go through examples of what those look like later. And I'm going to talk about at the end, when you kind of have a better understanding of like what these are and how to access them in the process, why you might request counseling or why you might request specific services depending on how your child or teen with SM is presenting and what they're struggling with. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to hand it over to Desiree with you. Should we pause to answer questions?
Yes. Christy, there are questions while I'm moving over regarding financial support for outside services, and then some questions about 504s and IEPs for kids going into kindergarten.
Okay, I'll take a look. Any financial help that families can get to get services outside of school. So in my many years now, there have been some rare occasions where the families have been able to have written into an IEP that the school district will actually financially fund services outside of school. This is if we are able to legally make the case that the school is unable to provide the support that the child needs to access their education, and so then has to fund services outside of school. That's tricky. It's not impossible. It really depends on the district and what's going on, and also what type of support you have. If typically families need an advocate to help, and Desiree could also talk about that too.
Okay,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll look at these other questions and then I'll just jump in to answer them.
Okay, so as Christy had mentioned, there are, like, while both the 504 and the IEP are legal documents, they have lots of similarities and some differences as well. So an IEP is a function of special education. So it falls under Ed Code qualifications and also IDEA, which is that component that guides all special ed and general ed functions. There are 13 areas of eligibility within to qualify for an IEP, and those are anything from speech and language to specific learning disabilities, autism spectrum disorder. There's also emotionally disturbed, which is a category we're going to talk about in just one second, and other health impaired. When I first started teaching many, many years ago, children with selective mutism were typically qualified for IEPs under speech and language impairment. That is not happening as much, and it's actually not the most appropriate qualification. My recommendation always, and I think Christy would agree with this, is to look at the other health impaired. We are seeing more and more districts, at least here in California, lean toward that ED qualification. And if you want wraparound services outside of your home, that's something to consider. But I prefer other health impaired, or there's a category for multiple disabilities. So that is a category for kids that say we're looking at selective mutism, but we're also looking at attention, and we're looking at a qualification, say, for a learning disability. For an IEP, if your child is assessed and you don't agree with the reports that were done or the assessment conclusions, you can request what they call an IEE, which is an outside independent educational evaluation. And that means that a third party comes in and they reassess. Many districts will provide a list of their preferred people to do that, but it's important to know for families to know that you have the right to have anyone complete that assessment. That completion and that choice is yours. IEPs have very, very specific components that we'll also look at in a minute, of services and goals, and that eligibility and present levels. 504s do not necessarily have those things. For both a 504 and an IEP, parents have to be notified of any changes to the document, and they have to provide consent. And additionally, there's a pathway for mediation for an IEP or a 504. So when you go into an IEP, when you very first sign the assessment plan, you'll get parent rights. You'll get them again at every IEP. You'll probably get them many times. And that outlines all of the rights for your child. It outlines all of the rights for parents, and also the path for mediation. There is a similar document for 504 plans. I think the most significant difference between the IEP and the 504 is that an IEP has funding behind it. It provides direct services. A 504 plan typically does not. That is not always the case. There are some districts and some states where kids can qualify for counseling under a 504 plan. So that's a service that's provided, though it's considered a general education service, or even resource services where they are, say, pulled to do testing, pulled for specific instruction into the resource program, or what we call specialized academic instruction. So we're going to move on and talk about how we acquire those appropriate services. So the process for getting an IEP or special education services, and even a 504, can really seem complicated and overwhelming, but if you know the steps to follow, it's much easier. So that, moving on, so that request has to be done in writing. Send a letter. That can be done through an email or just paper, send it. It needs very, very specific things. Include your child's name, your school of attendance, and their birth date, because that provides them with the information they need to access your child's file. Make sure that you add your concerns. What are they specifically? We have concerns about, and outline them. Make sure that you discuss what areas you would like to be assessed. Do you want processing assessment? Do you want a speech and language evaluation? Do you want assessment in reading, writing, and mathematics? Yes to all of those, by the way. You want all of those things. And And then in terms of private schools, I know there was a question about private schools earlier. Private school assessments can be completed per the same request in writing. So if your child is at a private school, they get the same assessment. That assessment is done at the district where the school is located and not your home district. Services, should a child qualify for an IEP, would be provided at the school, or I'm sorry, at your district, if and only if you were to pull your child from the private school over to the public school setting. Once you write that letter, the district has 15 days to respond to your request, and they can do that in a few ways. Through an assessment plan, they just sign it, send it, and say, we're going to test, and that's it, and you move forward with that process. Scheduling an SST meeting. The meeting doesn't need to be scheduled within 15 days, but you do need to get an invitation to a meeting within that 15 days. And then the last is a prior written notice letter. And a prior written notice letter, or PWN, is when a district is saying, we don't think the child needs to be evaluated, and they're denying the assessment. I will say this. My experience with districts is, particularly in California, is that if you get that prior written notice letter and they're denying the assessment and you wait a few weeks and then send a second letter, they almost always will do the assessment or move forward with at least the SST meeting, because it's not defensible if you end up in a court. Okay, so SSTs, student study teams, they also call those in some districts student success teams. So the purpose of that meeting is to collect information, determine areas of need, and then build that plan. It can include present level. So this is a really good time to bring in outside reports or letters from your pediatrician or clinicians working with that child. They can also be included at the meeting and have every right to attend if that's what you want to have happen. They're going to review progress. They're going to look at, what has your child been doing all year long? What interventions have been put into place? Are they working? And then make some suggestions about what other interventions, this is why it's really great to have an outside clinician there, need to happen next. So this is when you can build in fade-in plans. You can add in the beginnings of some accommodations. Typically, schools are very open to that, in my experience. And then this is also when they're going to make a recommendation for assessment, if that's appropriate. So,
Desiree, there is a question. Somebody asked, do you send the initial letter to the principal, the counselor? You send it into, folks are wondering, where do you send it, the initial request?
The short answer is everyone. So send it to the teacher that your child is working with, send it to your principal, and I always recommend sending it to your district special services, your director or your coordinator, if you know who that is, or just sending it in general to that department.
Also, what is an SST? Like, what does it stand
for? Sure. So it stands for students, I'll go back to that one. It stands for student study team, and sometimes they'll call it a student success team. And that is a group of people that come together. It will include the child's teacher, probably other grade level teachers. It includes typically your principal. It can include the school nurse, speech and other special ed teachers as well, or support providers, depending on the need of that particular child. So speech and language, occupational therapists, school psychologists, it just depends on what's happening. It's different for different kids, depending on need. Okay. So the assessment plan is that very first document that parents receive as part of IEP documentation. And that's what begins the IEP process. It outlines all of the areas that will be assessed, and it requires written consent from the parent. So it can include intellectual assessments, processing assessments, academic assessments, again, speech and language, occupational therapy, PT, all of the people that are assessing a child will be listed on that assessment plan and the areas that they're assessing. If a district decides that they want to add something, or the school wants to add something, another assessment plan, an amended assessment plan needs to be sent home and signed. So you will, as a parent, will give permission for each and every area of assessment. And then once that assessment plan is signed, it begins what we call a 60-day timeline. That's a federal timeline, so that's across every state in the country. The district has 60 days to complete the assessment and schedule an IEP meeting, and that is whether a child qualifies or they don't, with a few exceptions. If that happens with less than 30 days left in the school year, then they have the first 30 days the next school year. Yes, Christy?
Sorry to interrupt you. As we're talking about assessments, one of the questions that came in was like, how does the school do assessments as you're coming into this for kids who don't talk? I can address that if you want, or if you want to talk about it, let me know.
I can address it a little bit, and then I want you to address it as well. So you have to be flexible. Assessors have to be flexible with that. In my experience, there are certain aspects of assessment, certain aspects of academic assessment that are pretty flexible and easy to administer because I don't need an oral response from a child. The other assessments, say a reading comprehension assessment, that kind of a thing, you can do, like I can have children write in response. If they do that, if they change the test, it does change. You have to note that in the IEP because it does change the scoring. And I know Christy has some ideas about that as well.
Yeah, also, this typically, if we're working with the school in assessment, if your child is at the point where we are able to at least like to fade in an adult, to get some speech, if they're not talking, if they're completely unable to talk and we're completely unable to fade in any adults at this point with the level of severity that their symptoms are presenting, then like Desiree said, then they need to get creative and figure out ways to non-verbally assess, and they can do that. I've had districts do that. Another thing to consider would be requesting that the school fade in the person who will be doing the assessment, typically the psychologist, so that the child is at least able to respond with some verbal responses. So having kind of a warm-up session to the assessment. Another accommodation that's been made at times is to allow a parent to be present so that the child can talk through the parent or say answers through the parent. So these are different things to consider and talk about with your district. That's all. You can keep going. Sorry to interrupt.
No problem. And sure. And there are also informal assessments, and I find informal assessments to be a great avenue to gather information. So you can use recordings, having parents ask questions after a child has read a passage and record all of that. Now that's not standardized, but it does give me as a practitioner an idea of where skills are, and I can certainly report on that. So additionally, again, going back to that 60-day timeline, 60 days, unless there is less than 30 days left in the school year, or in the case that a parent or guardian does not provide access to the child, that has to be very, very documented, and districts have to provide proof. So like if they move, or if you have a child with excessive absences, then that timeline could possibly be extended. But again, lots of really good documentation has to be included in that. Okay, so the IEP meeting. So these can be overwhelming. There are lots of people, and that process is, again, a little complicated. Knowing what to expect definitely makes IEPs and 504 meetings a lot less stressful. I always recommend to parents and to practitioners as well to request that reports and draft goals be sent home before the meeting. It gives everyone involved a chance to read through all of the assessment reports, make suggestions in regards to goals, and then you're spending more time in the meeting discussing the results rather than reviewing the results. So attendance at the meeting, I know Christy mentioned this as well. The team can consist of, it should consist of, has to, the teacher anyone that's done an assessment, and your admin. So, and that admin can be a principal, vice principal, or a program specialist. Additional people that can be included: private clinicians, social workers, the nurse, and it, depending on the age of your child, the child as well. So for high school, I typically encourage my kids to attend IEPs. I think it's a huge part of the process for them to advocate for themselves and for them to be a participant, but it's not always appropriate for all kids. So that is a determination that families should make. Additionally, families can request to record the meeting if you choose to record the meeting. And I do encourage it because there is going to be a lot of information provided that has to be done at least in the state of California, at least 24 hours before the meeting. If families record the meeting, then the district typically will record the meeting as well. Outside assessments can be added to an IEP. They should be added to an IEP. Just request that, send the assessments. They have to be considered when looking at a learning plan for a child, but they do not override district reports. And again, as I have already noted, you can bring private support, bring clinicians, bring that letter. If you need an advocate, bring an advocate. And then the notes page. I find the notes page to be one of the most compelling and important parts of an IEP. This is a portion of the IEP where you can have anything that you want documented. And that, again, clinicians or families. So if you, for instance, want documentation regarding like what you're seeing at home, that's a great place for the notes page is a great page for that, or a great place for that. If you are disagreeing with the findings or agreeing with the findings from one practitioner, this is a great place to add that information as well. And so here are the components of the IEP. The IEPs now are sometimes 20 or 30 pages, but there are some essential pieces that are very, very important. Okay, present levels. So present levels provides information on academic and non-academic levels. So it will look at health, it will look at communication, it will look at academics, and then the social emotional piece as well. So all of that is listed, and all of those parts of the IEP should be completed. There's also an area for parent input and concerns. This is in every IEP. I always encourage my parents, when we're preparing for IEPs, to do this ahead of time. Because again, IEPs are stressful and there's a lot happening. So if you prepare that little blurb or that paragraph ahead of time and send it to the school, then they can include it in the IEP and it's there. If you get to the IEP meeting and there are additional things you want to add, you can always do that, but at least that essential piece is there. The next area would be eligibility and areas of service. So again, we talked about the eligibility, those 13 areas. It can be more than one. And they're going to check off which areas the child is eligible for. And this is when you're going to probably have that conversation about whether it's other health impaired or ED. Again, I always lean toward other health impaired. I think it's an absolutely appropriate eligibility area for children with selective mutism. ED, if you do not need wraparound services, is not, at least in my opinion, the most appropriate. Christy and I have had this conversation before. Of all of the eligibilities in an IEP, that is the one eligibility that could potentially follow a child outside of schooling. So once they're done with school, if there's a background check, that's the one and only one that can possibly and potentially come up. It is not what you want on a high school IEP ever. Areas of service. So this is going to be, do they need speech and language, counseling? What are those areas? And additionally, areas of service of, is it attention? Do we need social emotional support? Is it in the area of reading or writing or math? Every box that is checked in terms of areas of service should have a goal on the IEP. So if they check communication, there should be at least one goal. If there's a reading fluency box checked, there should be at least one goal. every single one has to have at least one goal, including if a child is a second language learner, there should be a goal for that as well. The next area would be the accommodations and modifications. And this is where you list everything that a child needs. If they need fade-in services or a fade-in plan, if they need to meet the teacher before the school year starts, or meet any new teacher that comes into the room, all of that can be included on the accommodations and modifications page of the IEP. This also will include frequent teacher check-ins. It can include pull-out for tests and quizzes, or for district assessments, it can include preferential seating. All of those things are included on that page. And then direct services gives you exactly what the services are for your child. It will tell you who they're meeting with in terms of practitioner, how often, and how many total minutes a week. The next piece are the goals. As I've mentioned before, there should be a goal for every area of service. Goals need to have a really strong baseline. They need to be measurable. And if they're academic, they need to be aligned to your state standards. Okay, so state and district assessments, there are accommodations provided for those as well. There's a separate page for those accommodations, and they should be listed there. That again should be very similar. So do they need to have things read to them? Can they take the test with their class, or is it a separate group? All of those things can be added to this page.
Desiree?
The final thing, yes.
I'm jumping in with the questions that are related to exactly what you're talking about. So once
Okay.
parents, can you define wraparound services?
So wraparound services are services that happen outside of the classroom or outside of the school day. And that could be counseling. It could potentially, depending on your state, be outside speech and language services. It just depends. It almost typically is counseling services, either individual or family.
And then also, somebody asked 60 calendar days or 60 school days, and I actually didn't know the answer to that.
60 calendar days.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. So the offer of FAPE is free and appropriate public education. If a child qualifies for the IEP or qualifies for services, the district has to provide what they call an offer of FAPE, which is basically saying the child qualifies for services, and it's on the notes page. It's a very specific statement. This child qualifies for specific services, why, and in what areas. And then again, the notes, as I said, for the notes page, it's a really great area to get parent input, to get outside clinician input added. And it's also a really great area to outline any specific plans. So like if you're looking at fade-in plans, or you're looking at doing additional assessments, just sort of outlining that, this is the place to do that. Okay, so preparing for the meeting. So I truly believe that parents are the best advocates always for their children. It is always best to work as collaboratively, I cannot say that word, as possible with districts and schools. And actually, I find that schools are pretty flexible in general. Where I sometimes get pushback, or I've witnessed that, is when they don't understand or they don't know what to do. So having someone like Christy come in, or your clinician come in and sort of provide those fade-in services, or provide that support and work collaboratively with the team, is usually really helpful. So as I mentioned before, request those reports ahead of time so that you have an idea of what to expect. You can request the complete IEP be provided ahead of time. The one thing that it will not list is services. You can also request that a 504 plan, the drafts, so these are all draft copies, be provided ahead of time. Again, record the meeting, bring your list of questions, all additional documentation, whether those are parent letters, clinician letters, Outside assessments can be added. You'll get your procedural safeguards, read them. It's not fascinating reading, but it's really important reading. And then the final thing that I always say is review everything. Families do not need to sign IEPs at the meeting. I recommend don't sign IEPs at the meeting. Again, it's a lot of information. Take it home, look through it, read through it, ask questions, and then sign. Okay.
And just to let everybody know, I think I'm going to let Desiree get through 504 plans, and then we'll pause and answer some of the questions that have come in.
Sure, 504 plans. So 504 plans are a little bit different than IEPs, as we've discussed. They provide accommodations and modifications in the general ed setting. And they are often, most typically for kids who don't qualify for an IEP. But there are many, many times when districts will do a 504 plan. They do not typically include direct services, but as I said, there are times when that is actually not the case. Counseling services are typically included on a 504 plan because they're considered a general ed function. And sometimes SAI services can be included depending on the district. 504 plans are reviewed yearly. Again, a function of general education and not special education. And 504 plans are created by counties and districts. So that's not a federal or state function. I'm ready for questions if you have any more.
There we go. Okay, I was muted. Okay, I'm just going to try to get through some of these. There's a lot coming in. Desiree, I'm going to need your help since your expertise is more navigating some of these specifics. So one of the
Sure.
many have asked about requesting an IEP or 504 before kindergarten. And like, I know that that is possible. And could you speak a little bit about that? I from my therapist perspective, I would definitely advocate for that because children with a selective mutism often need like the support at the beginning of the school year. That's when it's crucial. But there's been questions about that, about advocating before kindergarten. And then also if you've already had an assessment done privately, will the school accept that or will they need to do their own assessment? So I'll start there and then
Sure.
Yeah.
So IEPs can begin almost at birth, depending on need. So yes, right, it's the same process. Write the letter to the district. If your child is at a district preschool, even better. If not, just send the letter to the district and they will figure out who needs to do the assessment. And then I'm sorry, what the other question was about?
About when to request and let's see.
Sure.
Oh, if you've had a private assessment done, will the school just accept it or will they do their own assessment? And are there any downsides to requesting like an IEP or 504 before kindergarten?
Okay, so in terms of preschool age children, just do the request. I would do the request now. If you're looking at before kinder, the sooner the better. Once they're registered, it makes it a little bit easier, but technically they can qualify for an IEP as a preschooler. So I don't see a reason why not to make the request in writing right now.
Okay, and will the school accept a private assessment or will the school have to do their own assessment?
Sure. So the school has to, or the district has to take a private assessment into consideration, but they will do their own assessment as well. There are certain times when the assessment is a little bit different or they don't do certain aspects of it because tests can't be repeated within a certain amount of time. So like you can't, for example, give a child the WISC and then give the same assessment in 3 weeks or in 3 months. There has to be an amount of time that happens between. So then they would have to accept those results.
Thank you. Another question, can a child fall under 2 categories? For example, if a child already has an IEP for learning disabilities, could they also then qualify under OHI, other health impairment, for their selective mutism impairment?
Typically what happens is that, yes, but typically what happens is it'll go under multiple disabilities or just goes under OHI, that umbrella, and then the services don't change. but it kind of moves to OHI. But you can have more than one qualification on an IEP. They can check 2 boxes.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Another, I think I can answer this question as well. Like, so we answered whether any reason to not go directly for the IEP from the beginning. Desiree, you could add to this, but I think my understanding, the IEP process takes a lot of time. As Desiree said, you put in the request and then they have so many days to reply, and then they have to do the assessment, and then there's a meeting, and then there's so it takes many months. So sometimes what I will do when working with a family is first request the 504 so that we can have a meeting and have some accommodations put into place, and then move forward with the IEP. But Desiree, I don't know if you would advise differently.
No, sometimes it's very appropriate to have a 504 in place. It's easier to set up and to get. And then even prior to that, just having some informal plans depending on your school district in terms of doing fade-ins and providing accommodations. Usually schools are pretty accommodating, particularly elementary schools are that particular set of teachers is just easier. So you can usually do a lot of the accommodating and modifying informally.
Okay. Another big question I think that multiple participants have asked is, and I think I come across this too as a therapist working with my clients, with my families, is a lot of parents have said, my child is hitting like all academic expectations, they're getting good grades, but they still are struggling with like severe selective mutism. They're not able to participate or talk to peers or ask questions. And they said that they've had experience being denied for an IEP because they're meeting academic standards, and how you would navigate that.
That's the difficult one, because there's certainly an argument to be made that a child is not fully accessing the school or their academic expectations as much as they could. And so my feeling is that they qualify for an IEP, but districts are really pushing back on that. And so typically that's when they move to a 504 plan. And if you're just looking for accommodations and modifications, a 504 plan is a great plan. And you don't necessarily need an IEP. The IEP is more for services. So if you just want the modifications and the accommodations, then an IEP, a 504 works great.
Yeah, I'll speak to that too. That sometimes especially if we can get the school, which often if you have a professional or like somebody advocating with you, to include some level of counseling services in the 504, which I don't know, at least in the districts here, I've had success doing that, then there might not be a reason to move to an IEP. If your child is academically performing, accessing their education, able to learn in the classroom, then we might just need the 504, where we're putting in accommodations, which I'm going to talk about more, but where the teacher's agreeing to do a fade-in, or the teacher's agreeing to do positive reinforcement, or have communication between home and school. And the counselor piece is where we would try to advocate for the counselor working to fade in other adults in the school, other teachers, other kids. I'll talk about that more, but sometimes a 504 is sufficient too. And we can answer more questions about that as well, if there are. So there's a lot coming in. I'm going to talk a little bit. I see some questions. What if the district denies something you request as an accommodation? Typically this is the tricky part, like Desiree was saying, where it's like if you request something and they deny, sometimes that means that it is a good step to get an advocate or a professional involved to make a case for why they need that accommodation. However, that's sometimes the school will deny regardless of the case that you make, and we have to move forward from there. Desiree, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, it is tricky. And it can be frustrating, but I think in general, districts are pretty flexible Sometimes if the district isn't willing to do that accommodation, maybe the teacher is to a point. I think you just look at that the accommodation you're requesting and figure out how you can modify it so that it's receivable and doable for the school and for parents. Depending on an accommodation that maybe works in one classroom 1 year might not work in another, just because of that, how that classroom's set up and how that teacher provides instruction. So it kind of, it depends.
Okay, thank you. And the last question, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about specific supports. I think that Desiree, at some point you mentioned the difference between ED and OHI, and something about ED is best when looking for wraparound services. And I think that confused folks a bit. So there's been a few questions coming in about, could you speak more about ED and how it follows the child, and like the difference in what you'll get with either, or what you want to be advocating for?
Sure. So truly the only way that qualification can potentially follow someone is in terms of background checks. So if you decide that you want to go work for Lockheed Martin, if you're in a position where you need a background check, so military, certain positions, that kind of a thing, that's the one place where it might pop up. IEPs and their eligibility don't pop up in a background check for any other area. But there is there's a time and a place for that qualification in that area of eligibility. And for some kids, that's very appropriate. And when it's appropriate, it should be the one that's utilized. But it shouldn't be necessarily an umbrella eligibility for all kids with selective mutism. Other health impaired would provide the same services, the same supports, except for the wraparound. And again, the wraparound services are private outside counseling for families and for the child. And that can include support groups as well and a few other things, but that's typically the difference. As speech and language for some states, speech and language can also be considered a wraparound service.
Thanks, Desiree. One more question I'll answer, and then I'm going to talk about specific accommodations. There's been quite a few questions about, do you need a diagnosis to have a 504? Your child does not need a diagnosis to qualify for a 504, but they need to qualify within the school. So the school has categories that would qualify a student for a 504, and through their observations, or you could have a letter from a professional or a pediatrician to help make the case that they do need that. I've had districts say that they are requiring it, but technically they could just put them in a category within the school. So I think the answer is it helps, but it's not required to qualify. Yeah. Okay. So there's been some questions about like, what is a fade-in and what are specific accommodations for kids with, I'm way behind in the slides. So let me actually exit here and then move forward to where we are. Thanks for your patience with us. I know that this is a super challenging and difficult thing to navigate as a parent or a caregiver or an advocate. And so we will do our best to answer as many of these questions after, if we do run out of time today. Okay. So some concrete examples. So I put some sample, like when starting with a 504. So we're discussing right now accommodations. So this could be on an IEP or a 504. These are some of the main accommodations that I will initially request as a clinician to be included. So the first is, there's been many questions of like, what is a fade-in session? So a fade-in session is essentially for kids with selective mutism. We know that they often need the opportunity to warm up and connect with an individual one-on-one in order to, as I say, like bring them into their talking circle or have them be on the list of people that they do talk to. And this will look like a lot of times advocating for either a therapist or a caregiver to come in and participate in a one-on-one session with the teacher, or any a lot of times I'll also advocate for other staff in the school that's interacting with your child regularly or on a weekly basis. So like a music teacher or a PE teacher, or there was a question earlier about substitute teachers. I don't know how successful you might get with that. If there's like a lot of substitute teachers, then you could try to advocate for that. But essentially, this is a really key piece, because many times kids with selective mutism will not start talking to an adult unless they've had this one-on-one opportunity, because for them to make the jump from not talking to talking in the classroom with so many people around and so many different variables, it's a lot more challenging. So this is something I'll often advocate for, and I'll often advocate that it's put in that it happens at the very beginning of the school year, so that your child doesn't spend many weeks in the school year not talking to these folks. Now, if you're advocating in the middle of the school year or the end, and that's okay too. You could do fade-ins right now, and at least your child would spend the next couple months of school hopefully talking with that teacher. So I'm happy to answer more questions about fade-ins if there are, but that's an example of an accommodation. Another accommodation I'll often advocate for kids with SM is there to be some type of behavioral reinforcement in the classroom focused on talking and communication goals. Now, sometimes the school will say, this is a 504, we don't have goals. And you can say, okay, that's fine, but we still are working towards communication, and we want to have some idea of what the child is able to do in terms of communication. And I'll give like an example of scaffolding. So first it might be talking to the teacher one-on-one, then it might be answering the teacher's questions in a small group in class. Then it might be being able to answer a question in a bigger group, or perhaps talk to a peer at their desk. And when I say behavioral reinforcement system, often that's just working with the classroom teacher or teachers to decide, if your child's in middle school or high school, to decide what that looks like. Is it like a little card they have that the teacher checks off if they answered a question that day? Is it a shared Google Doc? For a younger kid, it might be a sticker chart. Having some type of reinforcement, maybe it's just social praise. Another accommodation is having it written in that the school teacher or personnel will communicate with the family or an outside therapist to scaffold support. So like a bi-weekly phone call or a shared tracking document, so that the family, as a caregiver, you can work together with the teacher to make sure that the accommodations being put into place are actually helping. This can be really, really important. And it's all about, like, it's in the meetings, it's about saying these things and then having the school put them in their own language. And then the other accommodation that I'll often request is that the school staff participate in some kind of meeting or short training in behavioral techniques aimed at reinforcing talking at school, or what we call brave talking. So this is, for example, putting in the 504, the teacher will ask forced choice or open-ended questions in order to encourage verbalizations. Or after asking a question, the teacher will wait 5 seconds to give the child more time to respond. Or when the child verbalizes, the teacher will provide labeled praises. So and these are actually like accommodations that will be written in that then you hope the classroom teacher will follow through with and help to reinforce communication and verbalization in the classroom. So these are some of the main ones. And then of course, there's so many more, and I just put some others that often we consider, which are allowing the child to come in early before school a couple days a week so that they have time to warm up in the classroom before other students arrive. This can be a nice time for the teacher and the child to practice talking together. Sometimes I'll ask the teacher if the child could come help in the morning, like sharpen pencils or organize folders or write the schedule on the board, and this gives them time to warm up. Other accommodations, seating that assists in comfort level. So for some children, that's the front of the room. For some, it's next to a familiar peer. If they do have a peer at school that they talk to, this can be really important. Providing clear and predictable plans of like irregularities in schedule. So if there's changes, if periods are changing, if you're in middle school, or if the day's schedule is changing, this can be important. And another is adapting school presentations and reading assessments. So we often have accommodations written in for kids with SM about how they're going to participate so that the teacher can assess their reading level, especially in elementary school, and also how they're going to be able to participate in school presentations. Some examples of an accommodation that would be written in that might say the child will be able to record their presentation at home and then share the recording with the class. Or for a reading assessment, the parent will allowed to be present for the assessment, and the child can read to the parent in front of the teacher. So there's all different kinds of ways that we've done workarounds of this to help the child participate on some level. And typically these accommodations will change throughout the year or over time or over the years as the child makes progress. Any questions, Desiree, coming in about these accommodations that I could answer?
Hold on. There are questions about what happens when parents and clinicians are offering to come in and do the fade-in trainings or to do other trainings, and the district is rejecting those requests. Like, what's your next step? Also, asking for a more detailed definition of fade-in.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, again, it's tricky. So this place of like where there's many questions that have come in of like, what happens when we request something, request an accommodation, request a service, and the school denies. As a what I will try to do with parents is try to advocate, like, and essentially sometimes it's within the meeting or calling a meeting to advocate why the child needs this accommodation in order to be able to access their education. So if the school denies a fade-in, for example, but the child is not talking with the teacher at all or their teachers, then we will try to make a case that the child's not able to participate in their education if they can't talk to the teacher. So the school needs to offer an accommodation that allows the child to ask questions about their learning, participate in their learning, communicate with the teacher if they need help. And if they're not going to allow a parent to come in or somebody to come in, then how are they going to conduct this fade-in? And I will try to, like, the best attitude to have is to try to be working with the school in the beginning. So I'll offer different ideas. Could we do it over Zoom? I just did that the other day. I had a teacher and a child in the classroom, and I was on Zoom, and I was able to fade in the teacher while being on Zoom. So I got the child talking to me on Zoom, and then I invited the teacher, and then I got the child talking to the teacher. So that's an example of trying to work with them. But if you are at the point where you're trying to offer different things and the school's just saying, no, they're taking a very like adversarial approach to providing any support, then I think that is the time where you might ask an advocate to come in and try to, or another professional to come into the meeting. And at times, there have just been times where the school just rejects, and then we do the best we can with what they're trying to offer, or what they're able to offer. Yeah. And then I wanted to also add in that I think we've already been through this, so I think the slide's actually kind of repetitive, but I did want to speak a little bit about the idea of counseling services as an accommodation. So as either an accommodation on a 504 or as a service. One of the things I will really try to advocate for is that the child receives some type of counseling services. And as Desiree has explained, if it's in the 504, it's considered like general ed counseling. If it's in the IEP, it's now a service that's written in, that's often with school psychologist or another professional like speech and language pathologist. Either way, though, my goal is to have what we call like a key person or a counselor or somebody that's able to work with the child one-on-one once or twice a week. So you could advocate for like 25 minutes of counseling, 35, whatever the school's willing to give. And I'll train this, hopefully we'll teach this person, like, the goal is to help your child talk to as many new people as possible in school and to help them like develop connections with peers and be able to talk to peers and to be able to talk in the classroom. So I will train this person on how to do a fade in, so that then, for example, we fade that counselor in, and then that counselor, we train them on how to do a fade in. And then the counselor would invite maybe the PE teacher into a session with your child and fade the PE teacher in. Or the counselor might have your child in a session and invite a peer from class into the session and fade in the peer and have your child practice talking with the peer. So having like this school counselor, this counseling provides the extra support that your teacher really doesn't have the bandwidth to do on a regular basis. Any questions about that coming in, Desiree?
I've seen questions about whether or not we have a list of accommodations or suggested recommended accommodations available, which is kind of coming. And then also a more specific question about an IEP where the team is suggesting that when the child speaks, that the people working with them don't react. And is that a best practice?
Oh, that really depends on the child. Typically, we want to assess like how sensitive that child is to being praised or recognized. So that's on a case by case basis. Like if some children love praise, or teens like they want to be acknowledged. Others, they prefer maybe to be reinforced in a more private way. Maybe the teacher has like their own time they meet one-on-one and reinforce them and like check off that they did these things or these goals. So it really depends on the child. I'll share too another in terms of like specific services. So if you do get to the place of being in an IEP, so definitely, as I said, counseling services, but then also specialized academic instruction is also a service you can advocate for. If your child is also like their anxiety is hindering them from being able to participate in their education in any way, or they need more small group instruction, this can be really helpful for kids with SM. It also allows for scaffolding and like also test taking in small groups if they're experiencing like also performance anxiety or test taking anxiety. So this is just a list of services that you can advocate for. And I also included here sample goals for an IEP. So these slides will be distributed. So I'm not going to go through every one of these right now, but I provided this slide as a way to show like if you are in an IEP meeting and you're wondering what goals should be listed, these are a list of different goals that we will often include for kids with selective mutism. If you're a school professional, obviously, and you're learning today, these goals would also need to have like ways to be observed and also ways to be measured as well. So for example, a child will verbally respond to prompts for verbalization from her classroom teacher in her classroom. And then it would say success with like 3 out of 5 prompts. So 3 out of 5 times she verbally respond, and it would be observed by classroom teacher. So as parents, these are references that you could take into a meeting to include for different areas where your child might be struggling. I think that we have about like, technically we have like 5 minutes. So I know there's so many questions. So I'm going to just stop the screen share and we can both look at the questions and answer as many as we can. Yeah, sounds good. Okay. Let's see. Some of these have been answered. Oh, also resource, I guess, since there's a lot of questions too about how to find an advocate or how to get resources, I'll quickly share that in this slide, we've put in some resources here around parents helping parents. All of these are websites or organizations that you can go to help find advocates. And also, of course, the Selective Mutism Association lists treating professionals and has a lot of other resources as well. And Desiree and I have also both included our contact information here to, feel free to reach out to us, and we can help connect you with resources as well. These slides will be distributed, so you don't have to worry about writing any of this down. And Desiree is also somebody who functions as an advocate as well. Okay, just wanted to.
Yes, I do. Little A advocate. So if you're looking at like fair hearing and those kinds of things, then I would refer you to someone else. And I do have a referral list for that. But definitely I attend IEPs and do a lot of what we call little A advocacy, which is more about making sure that the IEP or the 504 is appropriate and that the child's needs are being heard and less about the legal piece of things.
Desiree, do you have any idea about, I'm going through the questions from the top, like advocating for summer support? Is this a possibility? A parent asked about this.
So if a child has an IEP, there is definitely a place for extended school year. What is offered has narrowed in the past, I'd say at least 10 years. And typically that's an SAI placement or a specialized academic instruction placement. And so the academic piece of that is typically for kids that have a lot of academic needs. And so if that's not an area, then maybe that extended school year isn't appropriate. Kids qualify for extended school year when you are able to make the argument that not having any instruction or school support over that time will cause them to regress. So that's the big question. If you can make a case for the regression, then they qualify for extended school year. If there's not a case for regression, or that's not what the team believes will happen, then extended school year is not part of the IEP.
Thanks, Desiree. There's a question that came in that said, my child was able to complete assessments because they were able to fade in the assessor. And then they use this as a case to say that the child didn't need an IEP because she could speak during her assessments. I would ask, is the child able to speak in other settings outside of the assessment? This seems kind of, and it's also showing that with services, with a fade in, that the child was able to be successful. So it's more evidence that the child needs these services to be successful. So I don't think it would have been better to not facilitate speaking during assessments. I think it's just that the school made a poor judgment after this, and I would probably go back and challenge that. Remember that if the school says anything, you always have the right to challenge it. We may not always get everything that we're advocating for, but like Desiree said, you never have to sign the IEP at the table. You can always ask questions. You can always challenge things as well, and take your time to go home and read things and get help from others or advocates or the community that's here. So I'm noticing it's 10:15. I know that we were supposed to be finishing at about this time. I'm happy to stay on for 5 more minutes and try to answer some of these questions live. And then for anything we don't answer, we'll do our best to get answers to you. But if you do need to go, I'll just say thank you so much for coming today, and hoping that you gained something meaningful from being here, and have grace for yourself. This is a really complicated process, and it sounds like there's a lot of folks here who are seeking community and answers. So to really look at these resources, and as SMA as a resource, so that you're not alone in this process. Thanks all for those who are logging off. Okay, let's see. Desiree, if you see any other questions that you can answer, you could go ahead and jump in. I think some of these we have answered.
So there are questions about what the role of speech and what's the role of speech and language could possibly be for a child with selective mutism. Sometimes they're trained and they're able to provide the fade-in support in the classroom. So that's a really great push-in support. They can also facilitate some small group interaction and communication, either through sessions in their classroom or at recess, or in the classroom as well. So there definitely is a potential role for speech and language therapists.
Somebody asked, as an adult with SM, do you have any recommendations? I think that SMA is actually a great resource to to look. And also I know that there's actually an organization, a community of adults with selective mutism who support each other. I'm not sure of the name of it right now, but I will follow up on that question and get that answered, as we'll send out questions through SMA for anything that we didn't get to answer like that. Thanks for answering that. I see a lot of questions on fade-ins and about like training SM students and counselors. So I think that another resource is the selectivemutismlearning.org. I'm going to put that actually into one of the answers. I'll put that into the chat. Stop the share. That has like information on. Oh, for some reason I can't open the chat. Oh, there it is. That has an online training for professionals and for parents, and also includes some information about these skills that we use in fade-ins, like the warm-up skills, the skills to get kids verbally talking. If you have like more specific questions about exactly how to do a fade-in, there might be resources in SMA. It might be worth it to just do a few sessions with a professional, like a treating professional, to gain some coaching. I also know that SMA is running a parent group where they're teaching these skills. And so that might be a great thing to join. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I'm seeing a lot of some repetitive questions in there, so I think we'll take some time to actually look through them and send out some answers. Desiree, was there anything else you saw that you wanted to try to answer now?
Sure, just one more. There's a question about whether or not 504s or IEPs potentially harm future school prospects, in the sense of like kids that are applying for private middle schools, that kind of a thing, or private high schools. My experience is no, that is not something that impacts their ability to get into those schools. And no, you do not need to necessarily disclose that information. So you don't have to share past IEPs or 504 plans with potential receiving schools, but my recommendation is to keep that line of communication open. You want to find the best placement for your child in terms of a school. So if they're needing those services, you're going to want to find a school that is receptive to providing them. My recommendation would be to provide the IEP or 504 information.
Thanks, Desiree. I also just saw a comment that fade-ins are a practice of forcing the child to talk. And I just wanted to clarify that that's never what any professional should be doing. We should never be forcing a child to talk. That a fade-in is really putting in supports to try to break down the steps into much smaller steps, so the child can slowly approach gaining the confidence and the willingness and the ability to talk. So I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your time today. And I hope that the chat was also a good resource here. It looks like it was very active, and good luck with everything, and take care. Have a good day.
Thank you.